Uh, so yeah, good morning, everybody. And this is not a fake background. This is actually the office in overlooking beautiful Los Angeles Westwood. So, hey, Josh,
Hey, how's it going?
going well, going well. So, obviously, you got the top two people kicking it off for the beginning of the day. About what we're going to do and adapt. So let's start off with introductions and kind of your background first, and I'll do mine. People want to hear from you more than me right now.
I don't know about that, but I appreciate that. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know him, which is probably a giant percentage of you all, my name is Josh Palau. I'm the SVP of Growth Marketing at LendingTree. I've been in this industry for quite some time. I started agency side. I spent most of my career on the brand side, working on brands like Comcast, J&J, Bear. At Bear, I built an in-house agency, which is probably the biggest claim to fame that I have in my entire career, and something I'm quite proud of. And then I did a short stint over at PhD, helping them with some of their turnaround projects. And then recently joined LendingTree. I guess at this point, it's about 3 months ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, welcome. So I'm Todd Ulise. I've been in digital for it's my 23rd year. Started brand side, company that was bought by Universal, and went to the digital agency side, did a lot in the entertainment sector, and moved that on for about 10 years. We built this ecosystem outside of Google and Bing and work with many major brands to help them extend their reach. And, it's good to kind of have, the agency perspective from Josh, as well as kind of the brand perspective. So, Josh, let's, ultimately this is a people business. We'll get into the content in a minute. How come you came aboard, LendingTree? Like what excited you about the opportunity, and, obviously kind of moving away from the agency side?
Yeah, I mean, it was a couple of things. I mean, I first is in and again, for anybody who's heard me talk in the past, I mean, I I think there's a tremendous value of having an advocate on the brand side to being able to get the work done that needs to get done. And so what I've enjoyed a lot about my so that's always sort of spoke to me in sort of like a problem solving sort of way and sort of a change sort of way. As I look back at my career, I kind of realized, I mean, I realized it late, but it didn't matter that I realized that late, is that I'm always the person at an organization that actually has nothing to do with the product itself. Because my focus was all media marketing advertising, right? So I was never creating any of the over the counter products. I had nothing to do with our cable packages or what our internet tiers were. And I found like a sort of a sweet spot in that for me, because I always felt like I had this core set of skills and expertise that was very useful to organizations. And being inside the organization, it allowed me, the ability to actually make change. And so one of the things I say all the time is that, no matter how good your agency is, or even your in-house team is, like unless they have someone who can navigate the organization, push for change, make sure that C-level executives understand what's happening, be part of these decisions, it's really hard to get stuff done. And I can't stress enough that is not a criticism of agencies. I think that, when you're an agency, you bring great ideas, and you have someone on the brand side who's supposed to get those done. And I always enjoyed trying to get that stuff done. And I think I was more successful in getting the good stuff done than I was in not getting it done. And so it's just always something that spoke to me, just having that sort of direct relationship and understanding how that business works and how you could actually make change that is meaningful.
Have you found that change management has been difficult, or getting easier over time in your career?
Oh gosh, I mean, I was slinging banners in the '90s, so like it's gotten way easier. Though I will say, like selling banners in the '90s was not hard at all. And so, but yeah, I mean, everybody has up their knowledge, their understanding of things at all sorts of levels of the organization. I mean, you have a handful of organizations, more than a handful. You have a large percentage of organizations that were born to basically just interact with you online and build those brands online. And then, but I think we're part of the important part of your question, Todd, is more of like I work at big giant brands, and so I will say, like, me joining Comcast in 2011 to talking to people who are still there to this day, very different organization in a very positive way, because I think that just over time, everybody has got the memo that like the internet is here to stay. It's going to continue to grow. Like all these channels are going to flourish. I mean, when I started, it was still the fight for like give digital a little bit of money over TV, and what's organic search? Like, why do I do that? And so I think it's been this nice sweet spot of a time right now where the brands and sort of the CMOs and the marketing leads, like they understand how important this is. but there's still some level of understanding that they don't have on certain parts of the product, or not product, but certain parts of the industry and what they should be doing. And which is fine. And that's like, as I was saying earlier, like that's what I enjoy coming in and being that person to be able to do.
Yeah, you're right. It's, I remember the days where people would say calling up the web page, back in 2000, and is the questions were, is the internet going to exist again in advertising after the whole .bomb, and the drugstore.coms of the days. So in terms of like this is definitely a good segue to change management, and a company that has delayed change, from the death of the cookie. Now this is going to be the third time, and this is obviously a good segue to a data-deprived future. The third-party cookie is going away, not the first party. So it's very clear. The saying the cookie going away is an exciting thing, a big a big word, but it's really being specific. This keeps delaying. What's your take on why this keeps happening? On why it keeps
well, so I mean, I don't believe it's ever going away. I don't think it's in Google. I mean, and I've said that, and I said this because, again, I feel like somebody's heard me say this, but I don't know why anybody's heard me say anything. And so unless you follow me, and then that's about it. But I have very strong opinions about this, because I feel like some interesting things have happened in this whole time in which this is going on. I also will dabble in the world of conspiracy theories every so often to say, I sometimes wonder if Google didn't start down the path of saying, hey, we're going to deprecate these things because they don't make sense. And they kept pushing things down the road, kind of just waiting the world out to see well, who's going to come up with a solution, right? So Trade Desk shows up with an identity, and another company has an identity. And now we've got clean rooms involved. Like at some point, are they delaying the decision so they could see how the landscape's shaping up and then figure out how do they snap into that? Or frankly, look at what someone like the Trade Desk is doing and say, oh, let's copy that and make it better. So I that's the tinfoil hat part of the program. I think realistically, it's not in their best interest. And there's so much going on in the world of privacy right now. I'm not going to, obviously, look, you get fined for these things. I think privacy laws are coming, that are actually have some teeth to them. I just think that the amount of effort to do this, I don't see enough upside for them to. And if you look at it, I mean, obviously they're being investigated, they're getting fines, but they're not getting hit every day with something. Yeah. So there becomes some point of what do you do to remove this? Because by the way, while they have introduced identity solutions, the quicker, if the cookie were to disappear tomorrow, you'd have a lot of partners that would go to other providers, to providers other than Google. And that becomes that second part of, is it in their best interest? And so, I mean, I know, for us, when I was at Bayer, we heard the first announcement and we actually took it seriously. And for that and several other reasons, we moved to the Trade Desk and we started to look at their identity solution. And if you think about that as one small instance, I mean, if that replicates over, multiple clients, multiple industries, categories, all of a sudden, Google starts to lose its control over what it has. So I just don't know at this point, outside of, fines, which I don't take lightly, what the incentive is to get this done so quickly.
Yeah, there absolutely is none, and then, from a corporate development standpoint, they can either acquire or, right. or build, it's very simple proposition. Yeah. I mean, there has not been an alternative solution either out there in the marketplace. Right. Other partners have had value. So ultimately, let's say flash forward, if it is, since the topic is data-deprived future, does this scare you if it fully did kind of take place? Would it scare you as a marketer?
I think, so I'll answer it in a couple of ways. I think, and a couple of ways, just meaning depending on the marketer that you are. So for LendingTree specifically, I mean, without sharing anything that's proprietary, because it's really not, as you can imagine, we collect a lot of first-party data. So we at least have a good structure of targeting that we can do that didn't rely on the third-party cookie. So I think, my point in sharing that is really if you're a company that had first-party data, you were always in better shape anyway. Lots of gaps in that data, lots of third-party, real rich information there's a lot of rich information that comes from companies who are using third parties. So make no mistake, even with great first-party data, depending on your category, you're still missing some gaps. And so, but we're a giant step ahead. I think if you're a company in a category, like my old categories of consumer health, you don't have a ton of first-party data. because you don't want a relationship with your mouthwash. And so at that point, like you're filling in these gaps on purchase data and shopper data and consumption based on these third parties. And if you don't, and so I do think if your targeting approach was very dependent on that, you should be quite terrified. Again, if it goes away. But I would say, I guess what frustrates, well, I mean, it doesn't really frustrate me because I don't work at those places anymore, but like what would frustrate me is like, despite, again, the cookie decision being moved, it at least has been talked about for enough time that the people that I speak to who haven't tested, haven't dabbled in it, haven't talked to another provider, that's concerning to me, because if it does come to fruition, you're going to be left like significantly behind. And so I just think it's a great time to start looking into these other solutions, because also let's not forget that like it's not like the third-party cookie was the most, or it is like the most accurate thing in the world anyway. And when you look at mobile and Firefox and Safari, there's a bunch of places you can't use it anyway. So the idea that it still blows me away when I run into somebody who's still not trying to figure out some other spaces to occupy and some other signals to use to drive their performance that gets them further and further away from that cookie.
Well, and then part of it too, first off, being the search marketplace, we're not unhappy about this stuff. Kind of going forward to great, bring it sooner. So in terms of,
hey Todd, I just remembered something. So one of the things I think is worth noting or worth pointing out is like the one place, and I think it's a place the Trade Desk carved out quite smartly, is I think also the other thing to keep in mind is where your mix is. So to your point, if you're heavy in search, but also if you're heavy in, or if you're I don't know if it's heavy or not, but basically if you're doing anything in the CTV space, that's not cookie dependent. And so I do think that there's some view of, if you look at the more traditional advertisers that have always leaned in on television, like where can they carve out of them, space for themselves in the OTT space? And that doesn't require, like, who cares what happens with the cookie, right? That's not going to impact them. As a matter of fact, there's better controls in place to actually get to household level data, either through a trading desk or frankly, just direct partnerships with companies like Vizio or Samsung or DirecTV. So I think that's another piece to like the fear factor is like, well, where are you invested? Because depending on where you're invested, like even if third-party cookies went away, you might not be in as big of a problem or you might not have as big of a challenge or an issue as you think.
Yeah, and that kind of leads to my next question. Do you think that's going to affect the media mix? And then follow up to that is, since a lot of brands have multiple agencies, do you think the agencies are going to compete to say, look, my channel is doing better, invest with me? And do you see that moving more towards kind of brand consolidation and less of an agency footprint, in the long run?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things. I think first off, your first part of the question is, I don't think it changes your mix, because it's somewhat of a hard answer. I mean, and here's a statement of the obvious. Like, I think it changes your mix I don't think it changes your mix because you probably have some view of how things are performing. Now, if you believe, which could completely be true, if you believe that, hey, the performance of my display or my social is predicated on the fact that I can target users who have done a certain thing or exhibited a certain type of behavior that's been surfaced to me through a third-party cookie, then like you might want to look at your mix differently and figure out like, how do you get there? But I think that's step one. Like, I don't think you abandon display because it goes away. I think you go, how do I replicate what I was doing, but now using a privacy approved, a privacy approved product. I'm messing up my words there, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. I do think you explore some places that aren't, and this is where I was going sort of with the CTV thing. I think everybody should be looking at places that either are not impacted by the third-party cookie or that have true closed loop measurement. So whether that's retail providers, whether that's connected TV. I had a great conversation with the folks at DirecTV, and I know other people do these things, and I'm not plugging DirecTV at all. I just literally had a conversation with them about a week ago, just about like they have household level data. And so like through the app, they know, like, Todd, you and I watched a commercial. Well, they know they served a commercial. They don't know that I watched the commercial. But if I can take that anonymous data from them and match it with anonymous data on my side and say, well, I know Todd viewed our commercial, and then, Todd, applied for a loan or applied for a credit card, like that's true closed loop measurement. And I don't need a cookie to tell me that happened. And they have enough information on you and I to figure out like what the right households I should go after. So I think that's the I think that's where you start to see your mix maybe change a little bit, but I don't think it changes dramatically. To your agency question, it's interesting because I probably have my perception is probably poor on this one, because I worked at J&J and they were all in with Universal McCann because there was just such a giant business, and the team there was really good in terms of knowing the full J&J breadth of what they do. And so my point is, like, everything was with one partner. And then I went to Bayer, and we were all with one partner, but then we made an in-house agency, so that sort of went away. And Comcast was sort of a mix of a couple of agencies. My point being is that then also spending a year on the client side, on the agency side, like I saw a lot of all-in businesses. So sure, there are definitely companies that have search agency, display, like they've got different agencies for different parts of the business, but I still see a consolidation happening, partly because the agencies sort of bring that pricing scale and that workload scale to say, consolidate with us. So I don't know how much it changes that. I think maybe what it changes, I think what it forces is brands to ask a lot of questions around what's your expertise in this space. So if you are great at programmatic, but the basis of your programmatic strategy with clients is predicated on a heavy usage of third-party cookies, well, then you just have to know, like, what's their skill set to getting you out of that game. But I don't know if it changes the mix of the agencies you use, because the agencies are smart. Like they know how to use third-party. They know how to use identities. I mean, they figure out which way to go. I think it's just a matter of what makes the most sense for the client.
So, going back to one of the initial things we kind of brought up was change management. I think for, how since you said, you had, like, there's multiple pieces, ultimately that tie together, be it the closed loop management. You can see that you applied for a loan. How have you been successful in your career? And if you can impart any words of wisdom to anybody listening on the, about, since it's not, since a lot of this is change management within large organizations, how have you been successful at, advocating and communicating and affecting change?
Yeah. So I always like to say I made a career off of being able to explain things like a 5-year-old, because I had to have everybody explain everything to me. Like
I call it the mother-in-law explanation.
Yeah. I mean, for the record, I still am. So I'm going to give an example, and then I'll talk through it a little bit because you asked for words of wisdom. So hopefully this helps somebody. But I have a giant portion of my career is predicated off of one slide that I gave a billion years ago when I worked at Razorfish, and we had just won the J&J business for search, and we were trying to convince them that search was this important thing. And again, this is a long time ago in which, like, search it made sense, but it didn't make sense to a lot of people, especially because, again, when you think of consumer health, 80 to this day, like 80+% are bought in store. So, like, do I really need this search thing? I'm not selling direct. And so I had this one slide, and it had this picture of, like, a complete empty shelf. And I said, hey, like, so if I were to walk into Walmart and I would say, hey, where's the Tylenol? And they would say aisle 7. And I walked down and I saw this, like, what would happen? And like, it was funny because, like, you saw some uncomfortableness in the room, and, like, brand level people who were, like, brand new on the job, just out of B school, up to, like, the VP of the brand, were all like, well, that wouldn't happen. I was like, well, what if it did? Like, what if someone just, like, what if I bought all the Tylenol and walked away? Like what would happen? And so they couldn't even imagine that happening. But the point is like, they're like, well, we would call the shopper teams, and we would get in there, we'd stock the shelves, and we'd find out, like it sounded like all hands would go on deck, and, like, bad things would happen to whoever let that happen. And I said, well, like, what I just described is exactly what's happening in search. And while the product isn't being bought there, the idea that I can't get information about your product when I literally asked about it, right? So, or take it one step further, like, I go to the pharmacist and say, hey, what do you think where's a good pain reliever? Oh, go down that aisle and look at these 3 products, right? Like, and that for me was like this like tipping point with J&J specifically, where it just seemed to click. And so my point is not that I found some, like, secret or super smart way to do this. What I tried my best to do was apply 2 things. One, common sense, right? Like if someone asks for X, like, why wouldn't you give them Y? So when you try to explain things within organizations, I think it's like, what does the consumer need, and how do we fit that need? And so I have a different example on that I'll give a short example that won't be as long-winded as this answer. But the other thing is, I always liked to apply what happens online with what they've been doing offline, because then it makes it it clicks for them, right? So that whole idea around, like, what happens in store, like, taking search and making it apply to what happens in store clicked for a lot of those folks. And I think that's the big thing that people sort of have a disconnect on. Quick side story, like, I do the same thing. Like, I was having conversations when I was a PhD about live stream shopping, and I had all the ranges of clients that were like, what is it? I don't get it. Like, what do we do? Like, I go, hey, do you remember QVC? Yeah, this is QVC all over again, but it's online. And as weird as it sounds, it worked. Like, people understood it. And they were like, oh, okay. So like now, and then more thoughtful conversations happen. So my advice to people is apply what your idea is to how they do things in the offline world. Because even though the world has matured and marketers have gotten way more digitally savvy, just apply it to the ways that they operate in other parts of their business, and it'll be more one-to-one as a match. The other thing I say, and again, I can't stress this enough, I think we overcomplicate things. I think we need to simplify more. Like, hey, you're trying to reach people who do X. Well, like, here's how you do it. Like, and this is why you do it. And I don't think that's that hard. I think we as an industry have overcomplicated a lot. And I also will say that I'm empathetic to all of the partners out there, whether you're a platform or an inventory provider or a publisher trying to sell, because what is the difference between you and you and you? You all kind of look the same, but oh, you took me to Harry Styles. So like, let's do something. And like, I don't think anybody makes decisions that are bad for their clients or their businesses based on favors. I'm just saying it's just such a sea of sameness that it's hard to differentiate. And so, but the key to differentiating is not to overcomplicate. It's actually to simplify.
Yep. So, I mean, tangibility, value, simplification, and it's usually not necessarily the technology pieces. It's the human capacity to communicate the value. It's, you look at this, you're bringing me back to the Lumascapes. It's, you look at this like, okay, throw a dart at it. So, but the point you raise is true, and part of this is, being in tech, we're very in advertising, we're very internally focused versus externally. Like, what value do you provide on that? How is this tangible to you? How do you create a similarity to kind of create that mental map in your mind? So, some key takeaways for the Brand Innovators community, whoever's listening, simplification, value, tangibility. So ultimately, so now shifting back to the data-deprived future conversation. I love that we can toggle around and riff. This is a great way to start the morning, Josh. Morning for me,
Good.
not a morning for you. So
hopefully there's somebody listening, but we'll find out later.
Yeah, there might be 3 or 4, and probably those are our children. Maybe not, maybe our spouses. So will marketers, let's say third-party cookies go away. Will marketers have to, thanks, Brett. Feel free to jump in. Anybody that has questions, post it. Josh or I can both answer. Will marketers ultimately have to adjust goals? Let's say third-party cookies go away. Will digital marketers, being the shining star of the world, wow, we're not really hitting that goal. Will goals have to change?
I don't think so, because I think, and I do think this is another area where companies have struggled with how to do some of these things. It's like, I think regardless of your business, the goals are always, I don't know, they're somewhat close to each other. I mean, sure, there's always it's revenue, it's EBIT, it's consumption, it's conversions, it's those things. So I don't think that changes. I think maybe, if anything, I think maybe the measurement of those channels, if you, again, depending on what signals you bring in and lose, I think you just have to be mindful of how those play with the current systems that you're using. But I don't think those things change tremendously, because I think in the end, look, we want people to come to LendingTree, learn what the right product is for them, and complete a form, and they get matched with a lender, and hopefully that process works out for them, or find the right credit card, complete a form, get the right credit, get approved for the credit card that they need. So whether third-party cookies exist or not, that goal is never going to change. I think what changes is the front end of that equation, which is, how do I bring in a consumer that looks, or that is more predisposed to actually want one of these products, right? So and also, frankly, can actually get one of the products. So just in general, finding the right audiences to do that against. And we don't do any we focus on what the need of the consumers, and then they come through. We don't do any sort of weeding out of people based on any sort of criteria that comes in. We really look at our audience quite broadly, or our consumers quite broadly, and say, what are they in the market for? And then frankly, look, it's up to them to prove to then go through those steps to figure out what's the right product for them, and also are they going to find a lender or a card or something else that they need that meets their needs?
So being the topic of adapting to a data-deprived future, let's do the antithesis of that, right? Since you have your own consumers, they go through the form. The antithesis is data rich, right? So how important and how much investment do you think is going to need to be made in data mining, internally of what you have to, it's a lot, the old marketing analogy, it's a lot easier to, go shopping in your own closet,
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot. I think more companies are going to have to dedicate more resources into what do we have. I think the inherent problem that a lot of companies will run into. So again, if I think back to like CPG and consumer health, and especially like pharma, like you just don't have that much of that data. And so so then for those categories, now that said, I think there's a tremendous amount of companies out there that have data that is not only privacy compliant, but doesn't revolve or that doesn't require the third party, cookie to actually like stitch together what your consumer looks like. And I mean, and I'm talking like there's some great companies out there doing some work in what I think in the back in the day you think are obscure categories or obscure ways, but they're not anymore. I mean, I talked to the folks over at Deep Intent that have like, so if anybody in this called in the health space, like they've got a tremendous amount of, again, privacy compliant data around physicians, around consumers. So going back to my point of like, if you're a consumer health company, you don't have a lot of data on your consumer, like that information's right there. The retail media networks, right? Like they understand how people are shopping for products. And if you know enough about your consumer, so this probably hits at your question, but if I know that a person who buys this does these kinds of activities or buys other things that are in the basket, like I can probably work with a partner to say, hey, can you give me people who look like that? There's a great data company called Philo that does basically a view of it basically uses data from like cannabis consumption across. And the funny thing is like, I talk to people about them and because I think they're quite smart and good at what they do. But it's funny because the initial thing when I talked about Philo is they go, oh, like, so if I was Doritos, like, of course I want that data. But it's like, no, like if I'm a pharma company and I have a migraine medication, right? Like we probably want to reach people who are using cannabis because they're probably using it as a relief, as a migraine relief. So I think it's on the marketers to figure out like what is out there that we could look at, that we could look back and say, if you don't have a lot of data, so if you are data deprived, like what does our consumer look like and where do we stitch together the view of them looking at all these other sources that are out there?
Well, and that requires, and you bring up a good point, the thought process needs to be holistic and not linear anymore. We're
right.
often, used to a read and react culture versus, okay, like, oh, who doesn't like the Philo data? Well, alcohol companies, because it's a switching cost.
Right.
So, it's like you're consuming something. So, looking at, multiple synergies, and that requires using this thing above our neck, obviously to kind of extrapolate, because to your point, there are resources, there only grow more resources to make data investments, but it's ultimately like, what does it mean? What am I trying to do? How am I trying to do it? And what resources do I need to get it done? Oftentimes the resource piece is focused on versus like, what the heck are we trying to do as a brand and why are we trying to do it? And what do we need to kind of make it happen? So.
Right, exactly. And that's why I said, I think companies are going to have to like get a little more creative in how they look at what their consumer, or how they take what they know about their consumer and then figure out where do we find this stuff. I mean, again, back in the consumer health category, like, looking for people, it's not rocket science. You want to look for people who have bought in your category, right? Because that's the easiest, that's the bare minimum. It's like above that, are there other factors or modifiers that say like, okay, if you're an athlete, like odds are you're sort of in pain. If you're an outdoor enthusiast, like maybe you suffer from allergies, but that's not as inclusive of that. So that's why I think like, as you look at the consumer and sort of here's their demos, here's what they buy, here's how they behave in the world. Then you go out and you say, okay, like now let me go find like what data providers, again, the ones that aren't going to be impacted by the cookie, or what media channels. So back to like connected TV or retail media, like where can I find these people? Because you can find these folks. And that's why I was saying earlier about like the whole point of like testing into these other spaces. If you have been heavily reliant on third-party cookies, you have to test into these other spaces to see what they're going to yield for you. And by the way, I feel that way even if the third-party cookies never go away. I just feel like why wouldn't you find other places? Because again, back to my original comment, Safari, iPhones, Androids at this point, Firefox, like, and by the way, like accuracy of third-party cookies, like it's not a complete picture anyway.
So in terms of, it's interesting. We talked about simplifying messaging, but ultimately thinking creatively and complex. So it's kind of par and course. There's no middle, right? You look at the details and you extrapolate the strategy. What would you advise? I mean, obviously larger companies are more data rich, first party data rich. in theory, not all of them. Would this mean smaller companies that are up and comers, be even in the D2C space, possibly could struggle, in the future, since they can't make these day heavy investments?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say, I guess I'd say yes. In some ways, absolutely, because you're right. Just from a sheer investment standpoint, like having to spend the money against this is, smaller companies will suffer, by not being able to do some investments in certain places. But I do think it's not the reverse of this. But I also think, well, I guess there's other ways to look at it. Like if you're one of those companies that again was like you were a company that was born selling T-shirts online, like you have a decent amount of data. Like let's be honest though. Like you don't have probably that much data. You know what I mean? Like you've got my T-shirt size and you've got my name and address and you've got my buying patterns for your company. So then, how do you take that identity and find what else I'm doing to find more people who are like me, or just find ways to reach me?
If I were that company, I would buy, hey, you know what? Are you purchasing a lot of Doritos? You might need a bigger T-shirt size. So it's, to your point, thinking about things that are not right in front of your face, like that could impact.
Yeah, exactly.
Not saying that you're eating a lot of Doritos. You might be eating a lot of pizzas these days.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. But it's but I think that's where, I mean, investment will always be a problem. But I think that the way the markets are working these days with providers, it's like, everybody wants to work with the big advertisers, right? Because the big advertisers, this is the perception. The big advertisers have all the money and they're not going anywhere. And, and they want to invest in this because they know that they're also losing market share to all these like smaller brands. And a lot of that is true. I would also say, from someone who's worked at big giant companies for the majority of my career, like we typically have less money than you think. We're pretty stingy. And at some point, like we just then start to take the sheer volume of what we do and just beat a partner down to the point where like maybe they make money, maybe they don't. And so I think that because of that, I think companies have looked at other, like sort of, let's say, second, third, fourth tier companies. And I don't mean that in a meaning that they're not good companies. I just mean they're smaller. They're smaller in size, smaller in market share, smaller in revenue. I think they're finding ways to work with those folks because it's almost like the Google search model. And I don't know this stat anymore, but I remember somebody saying, so I remember for years we've talked about this stat about like the majority of Google search business comes from all of these smaller businesses and local businesses, more so than the J&Js and the Comcasts of the world, despite the giant budgets that we have. But again, it's sort of the sum of all the parts. So I think they figure that part out in terms of how to service those companies and not alienate them.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good point. But it's an interesting space to be in. Obviously the companies recommended Deep Intent File. They do great work, but it's, any other kind of like recommendations? I know we got 5 minutes, and obviously anybody in the BI community other than our significant others and parents that are on have any questions? Any kind of couple big kind of takeaways you want to give to the community, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I probably just reiterate a little bit of what I said, but I'll do it shorter. I do think first and foremost, again, if you're working within an organization or you're a seller going to an organization, I think the more you can translate what you do and what the benefit is for them. And I guess the one thing I didn't mention in our conversation, I think the key to that is understanding people's businesses. And so like the more you understand like how they perform, how they make money, what their priorities are. I know that sounds like really sort of like simple, but it's not. And that's not a criticism of people. It's more of like, you don't know the inner workings of a company. So you approach a company saying like, hey, I got this great idea for product X, but like product X is the worst product in their portfolio. It's just the one that gets the most publicity because it's just a big name, but it's got poor profit, poor distribution. It's an awful product for people to work on. So I always like to take let me learn more about what you're doing. And then let me come back with some ideas on like how I can solve that problem. So I think that's the first part of it. I think the other part is if you're trying to make change within an organization, and again, either you're doing it from the outside or you work within the organization, I think it is getting back down to like, here's what we do here's what we've done for years in other spaces, or like, here's what we're trying to do, and here's actually how we have to do it now. And so like, I could tell you when we were having conversations around bringing on new partners and looking at LiveRamp and Trade Desk and all these identity pieces, there's cost, there's change, like what's happening. And I think a lot of the decisions got made simply because I said, how we do this? And we target this consumer using this, this, and this. Yes. Okay. And that's profitable, right? Yes. Well, that's all going to go away. Meanwhile, it didn't go away, but like, that's all going to go away. So if you want to keep doing that, we have to buy this, this, and this so that we could make sure that when that stuff goes away, we could still do what we want to do. And I think the oversimplification of that, that's all that they needed, right? They didn't need to know that like what Trade Desk does is it pulls the data, blah, 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 and it's got this, they'll use the word bespoke or something in the explanation, but like they just needed to know like, what are we doing now, and how are you going to how are you going to solve that for me when things change? And so I think that's the other thing, is just make sure the message is tailored to that.
Yeah, I mean, you turn the darn faucet on, the water comes out. You don't need to know if it's PVC or PEX or what type of piping, and look, it's important to advocate and love the product, but it's ultimately the point you're saying. It's create value. What value and who's the value, and understanding and asking questions. I think, does anybody at the Brand Innovators, folks have any questions? I know we got a couple minutes. I always like leaving a couple minutes for questions and, for the community. Great. So, I think just to kind of summarize, obviously these are not game-changing problems, the data-deprived advertising future. In fact, anything that's a fear spawns creativity, and I think, as Josh said, creativity, think about other pieces that you want to do, ultimately, like, be simple and, understand what it is you're trying to do and the value to that person that you're trying to communicate. So, hey, Jamie.
Yeah, totally. You hit it.
Hi, yes. Thank you all for joining us. It was such a great conversation. Definitely like the analogies I could understand, and the oversimplification made it easy for me to understand.
Awesome.
Good.
But yes, thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you again, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. All right.